After my graduation, where all this historical stuff was already very much present, I got involved with the Research Center for Religion and Society, which was set up by Peter van der Veer. It was actually a transformation of, at that time, all the departments of theology in the Netherlands were actually in turmoil. Because of secularization, many universities didn't want to be associated explicitly with one denomination anymore. So Nijmegen had difficulty with the fact that it was known as a Catholic university, and the Free University had difficulties with its Protestant reputation. Other universities also realized that we are no longer Dutch Reformed, so, or at least that was part of the movement. And one of the aspects in Amsterdam was that a department of comparative religion, which actually was, I would say, was quite an interesting department as such, was more or less abolished, and the money went to religion and society. So an explicitly social science center for religious studies, with a strong historical bent as well. And that's where I applied first, but unfortunately my good friend Patricia Speyer got the job. The good thing about that was that we got to know each other. So, and not very long afterwards, in 1995, a part-time job opened up in that same center, which I could get, partly because Peter van der Veer wanted to give a part-time job to me, but also wanted to give a part-time job to Birgit Meijer. So we joined together, so to speak. And that is important for the output there. I think what was characteristic and wonderful about that group of people was, first of all, the atmosphere there, which I always cherished, of put it in this way, more or less uninhibited criticism of each other's work. There could be, especially when you sat down with Gerd Baumann, whom I really loved and who died far too prematurely. He would read a piece by you, he would tear it apart, demolish it completely, and then start to rebuild it together with you. So, isn't it much more logical to do it in this and this and this way? And there were things that, I learned a lot from him about writing, about composing an argument, about logic. And in the same way, when we always had these sessions with the six of us together on an individual paper, and people wouldn't spare you, but you knew that these were okay people. You could handle that criticism, and you knew that your work would become better. So it's an enormously high pressure, high quality environment, especially also because of the fact that Peter got a lot of money to organize conferences and stuff, and he told us, please, we have this money, do something, right? So one of the results was something that from early on I wanted to do together with Birgit Meijer, because of course we were both pupils of Johannes Fabian. We had both studied European missionaries in an African country, and we had both taken up this idea of doing it in a kind of historical anthropological way, because that was how you found out about those transformations, those social changes and cultural changes. And of course, since all missionaries are preoccupied with magic, usually because they think they don't do it themselves and disapprove of them in others, we had all the reason to broaden the question to a critique of anthropology that also said anthropologists have always written about magic as if it were the others that do it. But there's this huge irony in modern self-consciousness that it always says that magic is of the others, but they constantly talk about themselves in terms of, criticize themselves in terms of commodity fetishism and things like that. So why call one thing magic and the other not? We wanted to interrogate that asymmetry and the way in which, through those mechanisms, social scientists arrogated to themselves a kind of universalism, which on second thought, wasn't justified, couldn't be justified. So this was, I think, obviously, clearly, a very direct result of our interest in a critical anthropology and our having been raised by critical anthropologists. Interestingly, Johannes Fabian never wanted to do much with magic. He didn't like that idea, probably also because, as I later wrote, magic was a kind of trope of Africanist studies and Africanist anthropology. You know, Africa was thought to be magical in all kinds of ways, and it was more a construction by Europeans, I think, than that it had anything to do with what was going on in Africa. This was a theme that occupied a lot of work that both Birgit and I did. Right, she has recently also worked on the idea of how, on the question, how foreign is the notion of religion to Africa? Right, is that an adequate category to use in African context? And of course part of the answer is no, because it comes with a baggage, and especially with the baggage of an opposition to the secular. Right? Religion is in Europe always sort of opposed to the secular in the meanings it gets. That may not be applicable in the same way to any specific African situation. These are very interesting things because they play a role in almost every African society today. I'll get to that maybe later on. The whole idea behind magic and modernity was therefore to ask the question, how should we think about the category of magic and the anthropology of magic nowadays, given that modern people tend to deny that it exists among them, while we know that that's not the case. By that time, a lot of work in that group of religion and society, insofar as we were already teaching here in Amsterdam, also at the anthropology department, already started to move in a direction of what you could call modern forms of religion and magic. I became much interested in New Age formations, partly also because there were students that came to us and can I do a thesis with you on this topic? And we had to teach courses that did those things. But the other reason for me that was quite important was that by the kind of, you could say, multi-sited ethnography that I had been doing, I had also become interested, and this was a distinct theme of the whole religion and society group, in religious processes as they happened between continents. So I became more and more interested in the way in which especially British anthropology was related to parts of Africa. But increasingly I started reading in British anthropological circles more broadly. I became interested in the history of British anthropology as well. And one of the striking things is that there turned out to be a big group of 19th century anthropologists that were very closely involved with what was then called the Spiritism. spiritualism in English. In Dutch, it's spiritisme. There were debates, for instance, between Alfred Russel Wallace, famous co-inventor of the idea of natural selection, with Edward Tyler, where Tyler wanted to deny that spiritualism was actually a modern feature, right? He regarded it as a survival, while Wallace said, this is a new reality. I have seen those spirits, right? He had witnessed them. He was a bit of a naive man, although I think he was very nice, actually. But he was a bit, he let himself be duped, I think, by one of the mediums that he employed. Anyway, it got me interested because as an anthropologist of religion in Africa, I had always also read about spirit possession, not so much in the place where I did my own work, but I was also reading about Zanzibar and about Bagamoyo, so the Swahili cultural areas, where a lot of that was going on. I was reading about Zikr in up north, and so very quickly one of my questions became, why do people talk about spirit possession as if it only happens in non-European places? It's very strange. I mean, the modernization was taking place in the 19th century in Europe, and there were all these mediums and people getting possessed by the Holy Ghost in Methodist circles, and you name it. It was all over the place. Maybe not as frequently as in other societies, but it certainly could not be denied. So that became my chapter in the book Magic and Modernity on Alfred Russel Wallace and how he came to think that we should take this phenomenon seriously, and why that wasn't really strange and could be explained as a rational decision, even though he took the evidence in favor sometimes a little naively. And that was for me one of the real motivations for doing this particular project. We had an amazing conference again, because by that time we really could pick and choose the people that we thought were doing important work in this respect, and Religion and Society was internationally known as a place to be, right? Because there was money and these guys were traveling all over the place. We went to American conferences more or less annually, right? And not just one, but two or maybe three. And we were flush with research money. This was a relatively rich environment. Moreover, there was also something about the research financing system in the Netherlands at the time. Basically, my personal experience was that if I wrote an application, I could do that personally. I didn't need anybody to, above me to sign something, except the guy from the finance department. I could write my own application, and in my experience, I stood about a 1 in 3 chance of getting the money. That means, with 3 applications a year, I was once more 3-4 years, flush with research money. I could go to the places where I wanted to go. So it was a luxurious situation compared to the current academic environment in any case. That whole environment of religion and society was in that sense conducive to this particular project, because it allowed us to really ask the question, what is the value of categories like magic and of course also religion in societies where so many people are walking around with the implicit assumption that those societies are secularized or secularizing. Right, this idea of a linear process towards a more secular society. We had another colleague, Peter van Roden, a historian, who knew a lot about a lot of different countries, among others, the religious history of a lot of different countries, who always maintained that, the United States of America is the most religious country in the world. They have the most churches, and they're scattered all around the landscape, and religion plays a far greater role there than in many other places in the world. So we tried to turn those tables, and this book was an attempt to do so. And I wrote, unfortunately, for some reason, Birgit couldn't join me in writing the introduction to the book. So I wrote this introduction around the theme of this paradox of magic being, in modern eyes, something negative, something belonging to the other, while if you look at the major, the founders of social science in the 19th century, and in my case I looked at Durkheim and Moos, Weber and Marx, they all had somewhere in their writings a certain ambivalence built in which you could associate with magic. Right? With Durkheim and Moos, I think it was centered on the problem of the collective representation and the fact that showed, in a way, that they desired a collective representation in a modernity that also, according to the same authors, had lost it. So in a way, they went back to the magic of pre-modern societies in order to rescue modern society. That ambivalence was built in their work very strongly, partly also because of their own faith in rationalism, but also at the same time skepticism about the extent to which their society was rational. Of course, Jews in France that was almost wrecked by the Dreyfus affair says a lot there. Right? Racism wasn't exactly the result of modern rationalism, or at least they couldn't perceive it as such. With Weber, you have the same sort of ambivalence centered around the notion of charisma and its role in modern societies. Right, the prophet is on the one hand a rational person, on the other hand he can only be a rational person by being charismatic. So there's this strange thing there as well. And with Marx, of course, it became completely explicit in the notion of commodity fetishism, which was a major topic for us in that group. That may be important to recollect because one of our favorites and frequent visitors was Bill Peets, who wrote a groundbreaking series of essays on the emergence of the notion of the fetish. Digging into the African ethnographic material and bringing it forward to recognize that, ironically, people like Auguste Comte and Karl Marx drew upon what was regarded as the most primitive religion of humanity, African religion, fetishism, in order to describe where their society was going, their own modern society was going. So that ambivalence was absolutely strong. And that's something that still preoccupies me, and it's also pointed me into several directions that I'm still pursuing, that I find really exciting, apart from the study of fetishism and commodity fetishism itself, which I think is inexhaustible. You can do that everywhere, and it's everywhere interesting. But I also started reading about stage magic, discovering, to my surprise, this is still an essay that I want to finish, that I haven't gotten to. To my big surprise, stage magic and modern spirit possession are closely connected. Right? So the modernization of stage magic is actually partly attributable to people who claimed to be mediums, to channel spirits, Of course, channeling still is the order of the day, right? The New Age forms of that are really frequent. So, and I've at a certain point, but I'll talk about that some other time. I got interested in science fiction as a form of magic, partly because so few anthropologists were actually thinking about that, and it's of course one of the most fantastic, literally, modes of thought in modern societies. It's also characteristically modern through, among others, its techno-fetichism, you could say. But very few people have discussed it in this way. So magic and modernity was in a way, our invitation to anthropology to take some of the major insights of the classics on magic, on witchcraft, and everything around that, spirit possession, you name it, and bring it into our present day, our own societies, or realizing that the division between those societies aren't as straightforward as they seem to be. I think that was also partly the agenda of another major project in which I participated in Religion and Society. That's Patricia Speyer's book with the title Border Fetishisms. It was a kind of, I think it was conceived as a reinvention of the idea of fetishism, a rethinking of the idea of fetishism as, how to put this, as material culture, maybe. And certainly for me it became, the next big step after my thesis, which was really explicitly dealing with the material culture of missionary African contacts. A next big step in thinking about material culture, because I wrote an essay, a chapter in that book called The Spirit of Matter, which was partly, a critical engagement with Arjun Appadurai's Introduction to the Social Life of Things. Of course, Arjun was about a lot in Amsterdam, and we met him often in the US, and we had a lot of discussions. But there was an aspect of his focus on commodities that I felt did not completely take up that ambivalence about magic in modernity, because he talked about the human. Of course, the essay was tremendously important in putting material culture back on the anthropological, on the general anthropological agenda, not just museums and ethnographic museums, but anthropology in general. But his argument was to say that things didn't have a life of themselves, but they got their life through human traffic. So humans turned things into things alive. But then at the same time, he turned that around and said, well, maybe we should use a kind of methodological fetishism that treats the things as if they are alive. And I felt that was theoretically, there was a kind of theoretical friction between those two ideas. So that is partly what the essay was about. But it built on a study of rarity collections and curiosity cabinets that I had the time to do when I was at the University of Michigan, and of course the library to do it with, because that was a tremendous library. I think that still explains why I think libraries are places where you make discoveries, right? You roam along books, and even though they have a certain classification system, and you're looking for that specific number there, you put a book out, and then you see another book next to it, and it has nothing to do with. So you start wondering, what does it do there? You make connections that are absolutely creative and have nothing to do with your own ideas, but just because the books are arranged in that fashion. It's still a wonderful experience. So I read all these books, I wrote that essay about it, because of, I think that the other major thesis of that chapter was that the rarity and the fetish were the white and the black side of the same coin. Because the rarity was the thing that was collected by Europeans and brought into their cabinets, and the fetish was the thing that was used by Africans in certain, ritual sequences for purposes that Europeans didn't understand, irrational purposes. But if you looked into the descriptions of how a rarity was collected and how a fetish was described by, among others, also ethnographers like Willem Bosman and the people that Bill Peets studied so productively, you realize that the argument is almost exactly the same, right? It's sort of, so the subtitle of that essay was Spirit of Matter on Rarity, Fetish, Fact and Fancy. And I started to speculate about the way in which people engage with material culture and how certain categories relate to certain ways of appreciating things. Right? So fact is one way of dealing with things, right? But fact is usually meaningful only in a sort of a human construction, a kind of theory that you build around it. But fancy works in a very different way. It's later on I started to more and more work with the idea of wonder, right? What is it that makes people wonder about a thing? What attracts them in that thing? Because a lot of it, that passion, is in fact visceral. It isn't cerebral only. It has to do something with a structure of meaning, so it has an intellectual component. But there's something about the wonder that attracts people to certain objects, art, but also exotic objects, that is a kind of gut feeling. And that is described as such from early medieval philosophers onwards. And they regarded it as one of the primary passions that steers knowledge. So that's something I have been trying to revive in a book that is finished, but unfortunately still not published, with the same title, The Spirit of Matter, but this time with the subtitle, Religion, Modernity and the Power of Objects. So it's an attempt to grapple with that idea of the power of objects. Maybe we should stop here.